because we are very much attached to the 13 principles. So how do you link them? For instance, for example, recycling, animal welfare, etc.
Our entry point, because we work for our member nations and FAO member nations recognize the 10 elements. So the 10 elements are the ground for the step 1 in TAPE. And we have 36 indices that we call description scales that measure the situation of a system for each of those 10 elements. And then how we link to the 13 principles is that the 10 elements are aligned with the 13 principles. Most of them are common, and otherwise they can be translated. So if you take, for example, the element of diversity, we have 4 indices looking at diversity on a farm. For each index, we have 5 different situations that gives you a score. For example, we look at the diversity of crops, from monoculture to a very large diversity of crops and varieties on farm. The diversity of animals is the second index, including species and breeds. We have the diversity of activities and sources of income on farm. So if you have, for example, you just sell one product, or if you start processing things on farm, selling things on farm, if you rent stuff out and etc., that's another source of diversity. And then the diversity of elements, for example, if you have, for example, some hedges or forests on the area of the farm around, this is also part of diversity. And we do that for each of the 10 elements.
Okay, Guy, does it reply to your question?
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe an additional question. You said you can use these indicators, this grid, to design projects, and but it could be quite different to assess results, outcome, impacts of project, and to assess and to help design a project. Could you? There is a link for sure, but could you develop on this?
Yes, sure. So maybe it's easier if I show you how we did that, for example, in a project in Mali. If you see my screen again. So when you apply, well, I have here the Lesotho example. So in Lesotho, we were helping IFAD to design a project, and they were working on a lot has to do with the resilience to climate change. And by applying TAPE, we established some sort of typology of farms. And you see at the bottom here, we classified the farms based on their aggregated score on the 10 elements, so the step 1 of TAPE. So all the farms that usually end up with less than 30% score on the 10 elements of agroecology in step 1 would be considered non-agroecological. You can decide on this threshold as a participative approach as well with the stakeholders. But in this case, they went all the way to 50%. And so they made categories of farms based on how far they were in the transition based on the 10 elements. And then they started designing the intervention of the project on this basis. So they looked, for example, at how the income of the different farms compared for non-agroecological farms to those farms that are already well engaged in the transition. And you see, for example, if you look at economic performance, the farms that are more engaged in the transition were the farms that had more added value, more revenue, more income. We could see that also on the social performance, for example. So they designed specific entry points for all the different categories of farms. So you can establish this typology based on the results of TAPE, or you can decide already from the beginning. We have different types of beneficiaries. We have mixed crop livestock farmers. We have very horticultural farmers, and then you can look at the performance based on a pre-established typology if you're already working this way.
Thank you. And there is also a question from Christophe saying that TAP serves as diagnostic. What do you make from this diagnostic to support actions that are themselves supportive of AE vision, agroecological vision?
So it's a very good point. It's really we hear that a lot, that it's used as a diagnostic tool. You remember that the last step of TAPE. So the first one is a context one, enabling environment analysis. And then we have 2 analytical steps. what is the degree of transition and what are the performance of the systems. And then the final one is what we call participatory analysis of results. And for example, when we do this, which is really the most important step actually, we have the opportunity to look into the results and say, for example, well, in our system, tape shows this and that, but what really matters to our decision makers is the impact on biodiversity, let's say, or on the contrary, youth employment, which was very important in Mali, for example. And in this case, you can discuss how you could, for example, give more weight to a certain criteria or to a certain element as a decision of the group, and then change the results because you give more importance to certain criteria compared to others. And this is how we operationalize the results in order to inform the decision-making process afterwards. But in the end, it has to do with whom we're working. You know, if you work with a ministry, like for example in Nicaragua, the government is looking into using the tool to systematically review policies and the performance of different systems. In other cases, we work with projects, so it's still at a project level and not directly at a country level. So it really depends on the setup.
And have you ever been able to use it for conventional agricultural farms in any country?
Yes, so we do have an approach that, for example, when we're using tape for ex post analysis of a project, we do counterfactual analysis and we compare beneficiaries of a project to non-beneficiaries, for example. So we don't. The point is not to start from a sample that is already considered as agroecological farms by the the partners we're working with. So we do have quite a large number of results actually showing that a lot of farms are maybe sometimes starting to engage on a transition from one specific element, but a lot of farms are actually not engaged enough. And I would say that in most cases, we have less than 50% of the sample that can be considered already engaged in an agroecological transition.
And this is valid because I've seen at the beginning of your presentation, when you were showing where you've conducted tape, France or Poland, for instance. Did you do it at state level, I mean country level, or specifically in some areas or on some certain specific cases?
So we don't, since tape is based on a farm survey, the data, the information collected is and this is by design, has been the unit, the geographical unit of reference is the farm. We don't have yet reached the point of having I would say a cross-country analysis or cross-regional analysis in one country to talk about representativity. So we're always in a specific context looking at one territory or informing one type of project, but we have not upscaled that yet to a country level to reach the point of comparing countries or regions within one country. And this is an objective that we have, but we need to build quite a large database for that, and we're still working on this. We hope to have the validation workshop of tape based on the collected information, the experience sometime next year, and on this basis we would have probably at least one or a couple of reports on analyzing this at larger scale and trying to start building the upscaling.
And to complement on this, are you aiming at working along the Gleason scale, or are you still more intending to focus more on farm system, on farm?
It's a good question, and the thing is that a lot of the information is collected through the farmers, and then I would say consolidated at the territorial level. On the food system level as much as possible through the step 3, through this participative analysis of results. Keeping the farms as building blocks, but consolidating the lesson learned at territorial level through this last step. So it was this approach that was decided again with all the partners who have designed the tool. Initially, we were thinking of having 2 levels of analysis, in the farm and the territory. but it appeared to be very difficult to implement and hardly possible to actually conceptualize in a single tool. So we did have this approach of consolidating and upscaling at the end of the process from the fund to the territory.
So, and I'm going to the chat again, and Christophe is asking how far could TAPE be used in landscape approaches? For the moment, not.
Well, we do. For example, the IFAD project in Lesotho is based on a landscape approach, and the lesson learned from the application are converted into recommendation at the territorial level, at the landscape level. So it's not a tool that collects information directly from the landscape, but it's a tool that generates information that is relevant for a landscape approach. So it is used in such approaches already.
Okay, and there is another question from Guy. It also means we need to have complementary tools to analyze policies, value chains with regards to agroecology.
So to some extent, if your focus is value chains or territorial markets, like for example, we worked with the GEF in Mali and Burkina Faso, they had a very strong interest in territorial markets in the design of the project. And for this, we coupled TAPE to another tool in FAO that is looking at territorial markets. But if your tool is, if your project wants to focus on something else, then what we have in terms of value chains and markets in TAPE can be enough for you. So it really depends on the focus of your project. If you're looking into agroecology as a way to empower women, and then you still want to cover the way products are marketed, if the value chains are short or long and so on, you would still find enough information from TAPE to do that. And vice versa, if your focus is on markets and you still want to look into women empowerment, you will find enough information. But if your focus is very specific on one criteria, you may want to have a specific, a very dedicated tool to go into more detailed analysis on this specific aspect.
Okay, and to come back on the point that was raised with by Caroline in her presentation, she says that on EU funding there are, I don't remember, 6% of FAO project only being agroecological. Does it align with what you find in terms of your analysis of what's going on inside FAO?
So the analysis was, I think the number was a bit higher, but again, we were considering a larger funding base. But the thing is that this was conducted about 2 years ago already. And what we see is that in our portfolio, especially with donors like the GEF or the GCF or even IFAD, agroecology has been gaining a lot of interest. And we can see that in the design of projects, in the request from the different funding institutions, that it's becoming bigger. So if we were to conduct this analysis right now, we would probably have a higher figure. And I think this is something we will have to do in the short term.